So off the kitchen, which is over there, and at the other end of the room that I did the shoe bench and the microwave stand, there's this little room that I think has always meant to be a pantry. At least when we moved in, it had a counter and shelves and stuff in here, which we removed a while back. And now it's just kind of become a junk room. And I really want to make it into a nice pantry that's well organized and kind of keeps all the stuff that we use in the kitchen but don't use every day. Basically just make it organized and make it so it can hold a lot more stuff nicely. The first thing to do is to pull all of the junk that's in this room out. My son's chemistry set. And we used this room sort of as part of the temporary kitchen when we were redoing the kitchen. So there's still a few bits left over from that, like the paper towel holder and the little shelf I made, which is held onto the wall with a little cleat. It just pops right off. So it looks like on closer inspection, and I sort of knew this, that the walls in here are plywood, which is interesting. They're not plaster or drywall, which you'd think would be on the walls in a house. Now I want to do French cleats in here, and having the walls already be plywood makes them really flat, so I don't need to put plywood up on the walls to then put the cleats on. The plywood and the flatness of the walls are already here. So that's a big time saver on this project. I think I can just clean up these walls, do some patching, and then put the cleats right on the walls. So that'll make it a little nicer. So behind the door in this room, there's some trim that's missing and a little piece of the plywood wall. I found a piece that I had taken out of the old kitchen that would work for the little piece of wall that's missing there. It's a piece of fir. So I can cut that to the right width and then plane it to the right thickness. It needed to make up the thickness between the stud and where the trim for the door is, which is about 5/8 of an inch. And I can cut it to the right length. It was pretty close to the right length to begin with. And then for the baseboard, I just cut around the baseboard instead of taking the baseboard out and putting the new piece of wall behind the baseboard. So I just cut a notch in the little piece of wall that I was making. And that can go in place. And I just used nails to put that in. And there's trim in all the corners of the room. I guess because the walls are plywood, so they didn't do a skim coat of wall mud in here. And the trim is actually a square with a quarter round taken out of it. So I decided I could just make the little piece of that I needed. So I cut another piece of fir, then routed out the shape for the piece of trim. And once I'd put it through the router, I then cut the whole piece to the right size. And then to the right length. So there's a long piece that goes right in the corner. And there's a piece that needs a little miter on it that goes up in the ceiling. And I actually matched the trim pretty well for just kind of guessing. And I had removed some door frame trim from the house elsewhere, and I could use that for the trim that goes around the door in our new pantry. I could put that around the door, and that's the final piece of this woodwork in this room. Then I needed to paint, so I put down paper on the floor to protect the floor. I really didn't want to get paint on this floor. And there were a few gaps on the existing trim, so I went around with a caulk gun and filled in those gaps, and that works pretty well. There's a hole in the wall with a little vent on the outside, and I think it was for storing root vegetables on the inside in like a box or something. but I don't really need that anymore. So I pulled the screen off and I put a piece of insulation in the hole. I used Bondo to fill the holes in the walls, which I could then sand. And I painted the new woodwork first. Then I painted the walls. This doesn't really make for good footage because I'm painting the same color white over the existing color. So it doesn't look like I'm really doing a whole lot, except making the room look nice and clean and fresh. Now I can start making the cleats. So I cut 3/4 inch plywood into strips, and I cut them wider than a cleat by 2 so I could run them through the table saw with the blade vertical to make these cuts, then run a rip cut through the center at a 45-degree angle and get 2 cleats out of each strip so I don't lose any wood. If I cut each strip and then cut the corner off to make the cleats, I'd lose that corner with each strip. So this way is a little bit more efficient. And each half doesn't have to be exactly the same size, just close enough that they look the same. I wanted to pre-drill the holes for the screws that would be holding them to the wall, and I wanted each one of those screws to go into the stud behind the plywood. So I figured out where that was, and then I used that to transfer onto all of the different strips. Then it was the long process of drilling all of the holes in the strips. And the hole and the countersink that I wanted was bigger than any of the countersink bits that I had. So I needed to drill the hole first and then go back through and drill all of the countersinks so they'd be bigger. So it was easy. It just took some time to do them all. And I set the fence up on the drill press so I'd get the hole and the countersink in roughly the same place fairly quickly. But once I got going, I got into a rhythm, and it went pretty fast. And once the holes were drilled, I could start putting them up on the walls. And for the first cleat near the bottom, I made 2 pieces of plywood that are the same height, and I could use those between the baseboard and the first cleat. Then for the rest of the cleats, I could use a different piece of plywood for a different height so that each cleat would be parallel. So the first one I'd put up held with the 2 scrap pieces of plywood, and I could get that all set. And once I had that set, I could just start doing all of the cleats. And really all I had to do was make sure the ends were in the same place, vertically. Now the room is a little bit more than 8 feet deep, and my strips are 8 feet since they're from a sheet of 4x8 plywood. So I decided to let them just be a little bit short. And I think as long as they're lined up, that's okay. So you can see how I just went along with my 2 little scrap pieces, putting each cleat on parallel. And I checked every once in a while for level to make sure that I wasn't drifting out of level. And it seemed to be okay. And it actually worked out where the spacing worked pretty well, and it worked okay at the top where I wasn't left with just like a little tiny space that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Then I did the other side, and I was checking off and on at the end to make sure they were at the same height as the other wall. Not because I was going to have a shelf or a cleat spanning between the two, but just so visually it didn't look crooked. And then the ones at the end would then run between. And if they're all at the same height, then it'll look sort of finished and straight. And the width of the room is just a little bit more than 4 feet. So I put 4-foot cleats on the back wall and let them be just a little bit short. So then the room with the cleats is ready. So now I can start making shelves. So I made some more cleats, which would be the second half to the system that's on the wall. And I could cut those to the right length. So what I'm thinking is I'll make 6-inch wide, 12-inch wide, and 18-inch wide shelves. And I'll start with the 6-inch wide shelves. And I'd make them 32 inches wide, so there'd be 3 within each 8-foot section. So I can get the cleats finished. And I thought I'd make brackets that would hold the shelf up. So they'd go from the cleats under the shelf and then to a point lower down on the wall. And these would sort of be the structure for the shelves. And I thought it'd be nice to make something with a little bit of form to it instead of just cutting out triangles. So I laid them out in sets of 4, and I cut the inner section and then I cut the outer section. And then each one of those pieces becomes 4 cleats. And I made the bridges a little bigger and a lot more of them to sort of hold everything in place while it was being cut. So I had to cut those bridges apart to get the pieces out. But I just used a chisel and a hammer. Then I could clean up all of the brackets. And I did the outside with a disc sander. And I did the inside curves with the spindle sander. And there were a lot of them, but it went pretty fast. Then I could make the actual shelf itself. So I cut 6-inch strips from the 3/4-inch plywood. And I put a ravet on one side where the cleat will fit into. And this will hopefully make the cleat fall into the right place really easily and give it a little more strength, as the nail will go further into the cleat because the shelf will be thinner where the cleat is. I had wondered about making the shelves as an 8-foot strip, and then once everything was together, cutting them into the 32-inch lengths. But I ended up making all the parts at 32 inches instead and putting them together. And I can make a cross dado, I guess you'd call it, for where the brackets will fit into the underside of the shelf. So I have the shelf, the cleat, and the brackets, and they can all go together. And I just used glue and nails to put all the pieces together. And they went together pretty fast. So you can see how this first set of shelves goes in. So I will call this video done at this point, and I will do a part 2 where I will finish out the room. And so what I want to do is the 1-foot deep shelves over here and some 1.5 foot deep shelves on the back, and maybe a few more of these. And then the big thing I want to do are some specialty things. Like I'd like to do a box for paper grocery bags and a way to hang our cloth grocery bags so they're not always falling on the floor, and something like a coffee station where I can have all our coffee stuff in one spot. So things like that, some sort of specialty stuff. So that will be the next video. Thanks for watching.